because I wanted to indicate that slavery is a system built on violence. And so, since the colony of Berbice was built along the river Berbice, and of course the Kanji River, I thought that by blood on the river, I could reference both the fact that this was a rebellion that was violently put down. And of course, it was a violent rebellion, as all rebellions are, but also that slavery itself is a system built on violence. And that includes blood, obviously. So I thought Blood on the River sort of was a very comprehensive title.
In the book, there are references interchangeably to, was this a slave rebellion or a slave revolution or a slave uprising?
Well, I use the words rebellion and uprising through one another, since I think they're pretty similar words, and partly I want to vary my word choice. I think it becomes a revolution when Kofi opens negotiations with the Dutch and is very clear that he wants to start a state of his own, that he is not intending to become a maroon and disappear into the hinterland, but that he's saying to the Dutch governor, let's just divide this colony in two. We'll have our colony, you have yours, you do your thing, we do our thing. I think that is a way of saying, we're not going to be a part of your empire anymore. We want to be independent. And I think that makes it a revolution.
In the book, Doc, you said that as a historian of the Atlantic world, I was well aware that most of the major slave rebellions were suppressed in a matter of days or even hours, leaving few traces of their organization or how people shaped their freedom. Yet, in Bobis, to my astonishment, the insurgents took over the entire colony and held off the Dutch for more than a year. How did they pull it off? What were they after? I did resolve to find out whether Bobby's uprising had the same complexity as the American Revolution. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Sure. I came to the work on Berbice after I had written a book on the American Revolution, and I was very interested in the American Revolution as an historical event in which people very much disagreed about what they wanted life after the revolution to look like, where some people supported the Patriots, some people supported the British, many people wanted to stay neutral, they didn't want to be a part of it. And so when I came across all these records about the rebellion in Berbice, I was thinking, given that this is such an unusually long rebellion of enslaved people, would it be as complicated as the American Revolution? Because people always think that slave revolts were simple. People wanted freedom. And so, they just fought for freedom. But of course, no rebellion is ever simple. They're super complicated, and slave rebellions are no exception. And so I wanted to see how that worked out in Berbice, but I also wanted to make a pitch for saying rebellions in their own separate category. They're like every other rebellion and revolution. People fight with each other. They disagree over what emancipation should look like. They disagree over how they want to reach independence. Some people don't want to participate at all. Some people fought on the side of the Dutch. It's the same complicated dynamics that any revolution or rebellion has. And so I didn't want slave rebellions to always be in their own little corner as if they were somehow different, because they're not.
Yes, and also you wrote that this work or this revolution in Bobis in 1763, that it almost changed the face of the Americans. What did you mean by that?
What I meant is that the self-liberated people in Berbice came so close to succeeding. The slave rebels managed to kick the Dutch pretty much out of the colony. The governor stayed in Berbice with a relatively small group of people. He dug himself in on a big sugar plantation towards the coast, Dageraad. And he was pinned there for the next year and a half. Dutch were really unable to take their colony back for all that time. And the rebels were largely in charge of the colony. Had they had allies, if they had been able to be resupplied with weapons, with medication, with food, they may very well have won. But they had no allies. And what we see in Saint-Domingue, for instance, in the 1790s, where you have this huge rebellion, and that becomes the Haitian Revolution. And Haiti then becomes the first independent Black republic in the Americas.
When you're raised by an immigrant mother, you learn what's possible with determination.
And the
And if Kofi had had help from anybody, he would have won. And Berbice would have been the first Black republic in the Americas. And it would have moved the whole age of revolution up by 30 years.
How does this book really gives us an insight that is unique, as different from other works that you have done on the American Revolution, C.L.R. James has done on Black Jacobins, on Haiti. What was it that is so different about this work?
I think what makes the Berbice Rebellion so extraordinary, one of the things is that we have amazing records. In Haiti, the rebels win. And so there are no court records. And so in Haiti, we know a lot about leaders in the rebellion, but we don't know that much about the ordinary rank and file. In Berbice, precisely, unfortunately, because the rebels lose and the Dutch do all these interrogations of people afterwards, I have these almost 900 interrogations of people, some of whom are suspected of being leaders, some are bystanders, some are witnesses, and the Dutch question all these people and write down what people say. Not entirely verbatim, but parts of it, I think, are verbatim. And it means that in Berbice, we get a sense of how ordinary enslaved people, not the leaders of the rebellion, but the rank and file, how they experienced the rebellion. And I think that is highly unusual. There's a huge rebellion in Jamaica, for instance, in 1760, Tacky's Revolt, but we have no court records. And so what we know about Tacky comes all from white observers. But in Berbice, we not only have those reports from white observers with all the racist problems that entails, but we also have, at least to some extent, the words of the people themselves. And that allowed me to write a book that looks at a slave rebellion, not from the top down, but from the bottom up.
This is very interesting because you did say that few sources in the 18th century in which enslaved people actually speak. I like that. Their voices were captured in Old Dutch. That, one of the outstanding aspects of your work is your sources. 900 transcripts, day-to-day accounts, as you rightly pointed out just now. And that makes your work, probably on the Berbice rebellion or revolution, it makes your work the authoritative work on this revolution. You have the Daily Journal of the Colonial Governor, reams of European correspondence, 500 handwritten pages of slaves' interrogation. But what I find interesting, and I'd like you to talk about, is letters of the rebelling ex-slaves had written to the authority.
Yes. And so that's another unusual thing about this rebellion, that we have letters that rebel leader Kofi wrote to the Dutch governor in the summer of 1763, when he is trying, I think, to either end a rebellion without further bloodshed by negotiating with the Dutch, or maybe he's just trying to gain time. But I think he's actually sincere. And he has an enslaved man write these letters for him. And then there's a second set of letters a couple of months later.
Now, you also said that the enslaved Bobicians were among the most oppressed people in the Atlantic world. Can you talk a bit about that?
It's always difficult to sort of rank slavery, because slavery is an awful institution no matter where it happens. But Berbice is a colony that is still very much in development. And so I think whenever economies are still taking off, exploitation is greatest. It's a place where there are maybe 4,000 to 5,000 enslaved people on the eve of the revolution, maybe 350 Europeans and another 300 enslaved native people. In Berbice, about a third of the enslaved grow sugar, and the others grow cocoa and cotton and coffee. And it's a society in which the Dutch people who live there are trying to make their money in order to go back to Europe. They're trying to make their money fast. They have a hard time getting the numbers of enslaved captives from Africa that they would like to get. So they're exploiting the people that they have, I think, to the max. And it's a very tough place to be enslaved.
What I find fascinating out of the book is that you give these two perspectives, the one from below and the one from above. The views of the elite, the vision of the elite, the values of the elite, the aspiration of the elite, and that it was different from those below. So can you elaborate a bit about that? Because in a way, that makes the book relevant to our times.
Yes.
All over the world.
So what I found is that leaders of the rebellion, so Kofi and the men who rebelled with him, were interested, I think, to the extent that we can recreate it, in developing a state in which they would be in charge. Kofi was interested, I think, in keeping the sugar plantations going. Nobody wanted to work on those sugar plantations, so he had to force people to work them. We see something similar in Haiti, of course, in the 1790s, when leaders also want to keep the sugar plantations going because you need to have international trade, you need to get money in, you need to be able to buy guns and medicine and things to defend yourself with. But people don't want to work in those fields. So in Haiti, too, we see that people are forced to stay on plantations and work. And we see that in Berbice, too, that Kofi, in order to think of creating a viable state, he wants to be part of this Atlantic economy that is based on forced plantation labor. And what I found too is that there were quite a few people in Berbice who, even though they wanted to be free, were not keen to be a part of the rebellion. And I think they're not eager to be a part of the rebellion because they did not agree with that vision that Kofi had. They did not want to be part of an Atlantic economy. They did not want to be forced into the fields. They wanted to be independent, small peasant farmers who grew their own food on their own plots of land with the help of their own families. And they wanted to be autonomous in the sense of providing for themselves.
You know, this is extremely interesting. I mean, it's interesting from two perspectives. When slavery was abolished in Guyana in the mid-19th century, that's exactly what happened. The slaves took their 9 pounds, they pooled it together, and they bought up whole plantation and tried to start a peasant economy, a viable peasant economy, a cash crop economy that was totally sabotaged with the hope by the hierarchy of the time, the British colonials, with the hope that the slaves will go back to the plantation. So then after they gave up on that, they went and brought indentured laborers from China, from India, from Madeira, and so forth, to work on the plantations. And they learned from it. After indentureship contract came to an end in 5 years, they offered plots of land near to the plantation so that the Indians, for example, could stay if they wanted, or take the ticket and go back to India. And that's how a lot of them did, because they wanted to have labor next to the plantation. That's number one. And that's very interesting. But bringing it up to the relevance of our time is the role of local government. And I have found that in the Caribbean.
Very good evening, people, and welcome to Politics 101. Early start today, early start today. Wherever you're joining us from, those of you who are here early, welcome. We came in with an interview there with Professor Cars who has written this book on the 1763 revolution. We all know it as Coffee Revolution. And I think more and more Guyanese have become aware of that moment, largely because we have a monument to coffee in Georgetown, and there is still some memory in succeeding generations. But we still, as Guyanese, have not, even those of us who have read about the revolution, have in some instances studied what is available, we still are not as informed as we should on that moment. I like to tell my students about the age of revolution, the latter part of the 18th century, the great revolutions of the time, the 1763 revolution, the 1776 American Revolution, the French Revolution, and of course the Haitian Revolution of 1804. If you read Western textbook, they talk about the French Revolution and the American Revolution. They don't talk about the Haitian Revolution or the 1763 Revolution. And when you do Black studies, and I do teach in a Black studies department, we talk and we study the Haitian Revolution, but not the Bourbis Revolution, the 1763 Revolution. And so Professor Cars has written this book. It's called Blood on the River. And it's been making waves because I think it has opened the eyes of the world to a moment that we have glossed over or we have ignored. And Professor Cars is in Guyana. She is going to be making a presentation at the Theatre Guild on Saturday at 5 p.m. There's going to be an exhibition before. And it's an event that we encourage as many Guyanese as possible to attend because it is going to be riveting. First of all, we think of Guyana today as being world, part of the world. And we attribute that to, of course, oil and gas. But we have been part of the world revolution, dating back to 1763. And so what Professor Cars has done is that she has inserted Guyana into a larger tapestry of world history. And she has done that by going to Holland, where she's from, and getting hold of transcripts, records, because the Dutch kept the records. One of the things that happens when a revolution fails, as they would say, or is inconclusive, there are inquiries. The Dutch was able to take back Bourbis after more than a year. And they have inquiries, they have trials, and all these are recorded in Dutch, of course. And Professor Cars was able to go into the archives, dig them up, and put them in this book, Blood on the River. And she's going to be in Guyana. She visited Guyana while she was doing her research. She went to the site of the revolution in Bourbis. And so she's going to be there for this event. Tonight we want to talk a little bit about that revolution. My guests are Brother Chief Eric Phillips, who is usually here, and the CEO of ITPADG. And I think ITPADG is hosting Professor Cars. And we are going to talk a little bit about the 1763 revolution as an intro, if you will, to Professor Cars' appearance this weekend. So please share the link, and share the live, as some of you would say, and we will start our discussion now. Good evening, Sister Olive. Brother Eric is going to join us momentarily. Good evening, Sister Olive. You're muted.
Sorry, thank you. Good evening, and thank you for inviting me on. Good evening to your audience as well.
And your organization, IPADG, is sponsoring this visit to Guyana by Professor Cars. Is that true?
That is correct. We are, this visit, she's a guest of Ipadagy, and we're grateful to Hughes, Fields, and Stobie for making this possible because, as you know, David, Ipadagy does not have those kinds of resources. But so we are grateful to Hughes, Fields, and Stobie for helping us to bring her here. And we are looking forward to her engagement on Saturday in this event. As you pointed out, the 1763 revolution was the first in a series of revolutions that changed the shape of world history. And we were not taught of it. We never were taught that. We were taught about this event as a one-off, failed revolution. In fact, we were taught it was a rebellion, as though these people were outcasts. And these were freedom fighters in today's terms. And had they been in North America, had it been North America, the narrative would have been more empowering and more positive. But here are a group of enslaved persons who fight for their freedom, who successfully hold a republic that they declare for a year. And the only reason that they are defeated is because the Dutch, they are able to bring in a coalition of European troops, and they're able to, through their alliances with the indigenous people, the Amerindian people, they're able to sort of those who are fighting for freedom, the freedom fighters, they're able to corral them into a space because they couldn't go farther away, farther into the interior, because the Amerindians were creating kind of a wall enclosing them. They were starved of munitions and limited food, and as a result, they were defeated. But the point that we have to take away from this is that they fought for their freedom. They used diplomacy for a long time. Kofi, or Kofi, as we should begin to call him, because that is his Akan name, an Akan man born on a Friday. He engaged the Dutch, as Paul Tennessee was saying in that tape you just played, in letters, engaging them diplomatically and establishing relationships that ought to have led to the creation of relationship in terms of trade, and therefore the permanency of this Berbice Republic that he envisioned. A lot of what we've learned in this process is the skills that African warriors, people who were militarily trained before they were enslaved, brought to this fight. And Professor Cars will speak to that. These were not just persons who were wildly marauding as rebels. These were people with military training who created military structures and governance in the space that they controlled. And so we're looking forward on Saturday to an enlightening discussion, a presentation, and then opportunity for questions and answers, as well as an empowering event, because we must walk away from this erasing the notion that our ancestors were simply unskilled, unschooled, and incapable of maintaining their freedom. They were overpowered by hundreds of Europeans who had munitions, who were better fed, and fully equipped to win a fight. It was an uneven battle, but for 1 year, they held the Europeans off, the Dutch off.
Brother Eric, let me bring you in because when you think, first of all, C.L.R. James brought the Haitian Revolution.
Yeah, Black Jacobins. Yeah.
In the Black Jacobins, one of the outstanding books that have come out of our Caribbean, that he humanized that revolution, put that revolution in its larger global context. And in some regard, Professor Cars has done that. I'm in no way equating or comparing Professor Charles to C.L.R. James, because C.L.R. James is in a category by himself. But the book does the same thing. Now, the three of us here are Guyanese. Our audience is mostly Guyanese. And think what it means to, as Guyanese, come to the understanding, Eric and Olive, that we were so close to being the place that gave the world its first Black republic.
Before Haiti, yeah.
Before Haiti. Speak to that, Eric, in terms of what it means first for African people, because there is a narrative in Guyana that we were slaves, we were stupid, we made bad choices, and so forth. Now, they don't say it as raw as I'm saying it, but they insinuate that, and so forth. Speak about the importance of that moment, because there are several stories here. There is the European story, which is that the revolution, the rebellion was defeated. But the other story, and that is what I want you to speak to, Eric, is that they governed the state. Kofi and his compatriots governed the state for more than a year. And what has come out as you read this book is that they knew something about statecraft. Eric, over to you.
Good night, Olive. Good night, Chief. Yes, indeed, as Olive indicated, they had a structure, they had a governance structure. Kofi and Atta knew exactly what they wanted. Of course, Professor Kors also indicated that the type of state Kofi wanted, many of the freed Africans who were fighting with him didn't want it, because he was actually mirroring the Dutch state, continuing slavery in a sense to grow crops to trade. But he had a plan. He was very structured. He had an army. The army had different levels. And of course, they wrote letters to the governor. The first was in Dutch, because they had also had some white Dutchmen who had abandoned the army of the Dutch and joined Kofi. There were 28 of them, I think. And so the first letter was written in Dutch. But he knew what he wanted. It's the first ever recorded history of shared governance. He was promoting shared governance. He said, you govern your half, I'll govern mine half. What was also very instrumental in this is because they were not successful, partly because the indigenous people, especially the Caribs, blocked them from getting to Essequibo and Demerara. And indeed, that was the most significant part of it. There were internal battles, of course, because you had Africans who had just come from Africa. Kofi was one. You had Creoles who were born in Berbice. And then you had this mixture of white folks who were part of the army. So the hidden story here is that we would have been the first republic had it not been for deception, had it not been for the Caribs blocking them from going Demerara, Essequibo, and had it not been for internal struggles. Some of it had to do with Atta attacking when he shouldn't have. And of course, that broke the strategy that Kofi was pursuing, which was to peacefully negotiate, diplomatically negotiate, that got trumped. But we would have been the first free Black republic. It's hidden in history because they don't want to tell people what the Dutch did. The Dutch were very brutal. 1,800 Africans died during 1763. 40 white folks died. and it's how they died and what they did with them in terms of burning them alive, breaking them at the rack. It just showed Dutch brutality, but they didn't really put that into the public domain because they didn't want that part of history to be part of this general era of revolution. So you talk. I mean, 1823 was another significant revolution in Guyana, where our folks were organized. They were organized through the church. So every time we had a revolution, there was organization, there was structure, there was governance, whether it was in 1763 or 1823. And it's a pity that we weren't the first Black Republic because we would have been very different today. There would have been no indentureship. Guyana would have been extraordinarily different. And we, as people of African descent, would be controlling all this oil together with our indigenous people. So history, that was really a severe blow in history for us.
Sister Olive and Eric, let me, and I want to press us on this point because people point to it as a weakness of the revolution, and that is the strategies. Kofi's strategy, which was to integrate the new colony in the existing status quo.
Right.
And then the others who wanted a clean break with the colonial thing. Now, fast forward to independence, and the same conversation. As a new country, is Guyana, is Jamaica, is Trinidad and Tobago.
The Federation.
Yes. Are we going to work within the neo-colonialist framework, or are we going to do as the revolutionaries of that time said, make a clean break with colonialism and so forth? In the end, here we are today in 2024. In a sense, I think we have come full circle from 1763 to find a way of balancing existing within the larger global framework of capitalism and so forth, while pursuing nationalism. I think we are at that moment where...
Well, again, David, if you look at Haiti, they took the different route.
Yes.
And the West punished them since then until today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. What Kofi was trying to do was to integrate within the system and even using some of their architectures to maintain the status quo. We're at the same point today. Because of oil, it's become more difficult.
Yes.
The geopolitics has changed. There's so much at stake that we are being integrated into an architecture that doesn't benefit us. And therefore, the other option is partition. And those discussions have been going on for quite a while because we inherited the winner-take-all architecture, which imprisons us. Because at emancipation, we had 80,000 freed Africans. And over 238,000 Indians came here, 75,000 went back. So there were twice as many Indians here, plus Portuguese, plus Chinese, plus us. And since we were not paid, we had no generational wealth. And since the white infrastructure supported the Portuguese and Chinese, we were pushed to the bottom of the ladder, which is where we are today. So we've integrated. And where we are today, Haiti took a different option, and geopolitics has changed.
Right. Olive, I want you to comment on that thing, on that subject, the subject of the choices or the choice that Kofi had. Yeah. I want you to elaborate on that because it is pivotal in putting Kofi and the revolution in its proper context.
Precisely. And let me just take a moment, David, to push back on one notion that I think we share. It's almost a knee-jerk thing. We have to make it very clear that the Berbice Republic was the first republic in the Western Hemisphere.
Yes.
Whether it lasted a day or a year.
Or
and so
10
we
months.
need to change that narrative. The Berbice Republic was the first republic in the Western Hemisphere, and it was started by people of African descent.
Yes.
The European narrative is what we have been holding on to. And I think we need to change that because it changes the way we see ourselves in the world and what we have accomplished. So I think that in reading the book, and we have had a group reading the book for the last several months. We meet every Thursday and we follow up on this book. And in reading the book, one of the things that struck me is that I saw what Kofi was doing was trying to thread a very difficult situation, right? He could not envision, and I don't think that Atta or Akara could either figure out a way in which this new republic could coexist or exist without having to use the Berbice River as a way to trade. That would take them past New Amsterdam, past the forts. They could not do that without some kind of an agreement, a negotiated peace, and an understanding with the Dutch. They also knew that their entree to international markets would have to be through these established routes and through the shipping, that the structure, the architecture was there. You know, it is not unlike where we were, as you pointed out, at independence and where we are now. One cannot exist apart from the international infrastructure that unfortunately was not established to benefit people like us, right? It still doesn't, right? And so I think Kofi was smart. I think he made the right decisions. And I also want to point this out now because I wouldn't like the show to end without saying that in all of that we ever learned of the revolution and Kofi's end, we learned that he committed suicide. And Professor Kars is very clear about the fact that he committed an honorable suicide because coming out of his tradition, if you have lost the loyalty and the support of your followers, the honorable thing to do is to take yourself out of it so that you can avoid any total disruption and destruction. So in that way, he was being an honorable military leader.
Yes.
Very powerful point. Very, very powerful point. You know, C.L.R. James, we go back to Black Jacobins, because there are some Black scholars today who says C.L.R. James was being romantic. He constructed a romantic picture of the Asian Revolution. But by God, yes, he did. And yes, he must do. And that is what I think that lady, that professor, has opened up for us to do. And that is to humanize our contribution to the first Black Republic in the war, in the Western Hemisphere. And in many regards, if we anchor ourselves as African people to that history, our concept of who we are would undergo tremendous change. That is, nobody tells your story. The victor tells the story from the perspective of the victor, the Dutch. And therefore, we have to tell the story from our perspective.
Absolutely.
And this whole notion, Olive, thank you very much. This whole notion that it was a failed rebellion, that has lived with me throughout my life, because from a small boy, I would listen to the historians talk about the revolution. And I would always hear
David Burnham didn't see it as a failed revolution. If not, he wouldn't have made Kofi his national hero.
Exactly, national hero. Exactly. But you know, there's one other point that I'd like to make. And this is my own personal belief based on my reading of history. It is not widely known, because I know that I only discovered this when I was a student. I actually had the opportunity to study at the University of Madrid in Spain. And when I went there, I learned that the Moors, or Africans, had conquered that part of Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, and had made inroads into Northern Europe. And
700 years.
700 years. Now, so the exposure that Europeans had to people from the African continent was through that conquest. In that conquest, the Africans brought to Europe universities. They brought street
Hospitals,
hospitals. They brought
sanitation,
street lights, sanitation. I mean,
architecture.
structured
Yeah,
architecture. That when you visit southern Spain and Portugal and parts
yeah.
of southern Italy, you're amazed by what Africans did. So their
Yeah, that's
exposure to
1400. This
Africans,
since 1450, around that.
1492, just
Yeah,
well in the late 1400s. So
100.
it is not, and these Africans were mariners. These are people who knew the sea. And if we go back to Van Sertima, they had traversed the Atlantic centuries, millennia
Olive,
before the
there's a
Europeans.
claim that Columbus was brought here. He had four Moors. This
Listen,
lady who is at the Stabroek News, I'm forgetting the name, the historian, she actually wrote an
And
article on that.
Benjamin,
Anna Benjamin.
And Benjamin.
Mhm.
But
But
I
let
want
me
to add
finish my
something to what
point,
both of
please.
you have been saying.
Eric, let me
Finish,
finish
Olive.
this one point.
Yeah,
Eric,
I'm trying to
let her
tie
finish
this
the point.
together.
yeah.
I'm tying this together. What I'm saying is that this is their exposure. They saw Africans as skilled, knowledgeable persons who really ignited the Renaissance of Europe. Because the Renaissance takes place when you look at the
Yes.
timeline, right? So they knew who Africans were. When they decided to traverse, to leave Europe and to do this grand discovery, it is interesting. This occurs in 1492, after Africans had already done what they did.
Right.
They selected Africans to be enslaved, to work, to be workers for them, because they knew the work that Africans could do.
And the
That's the
intellectual
story we
property
need to
we had.
start to. Yes, they knew. And so that is why they went to Africa, because of the skills they knew they could find there. So sorry, I had to tell that whole story.
No, you're right. But let me tell you something else. I mean, Olive, I'm glad we've repositioned that this was the first Black Republic, because what is going on is that we've been repositioned out to history.
Precisely.
The 1823 was the first nonviolent revolution in terms of the church and people, Africans who are again organized through the church, who are again educated.
Mhm.
And then Damon in 1838, right? That was another peaceful demonstration. So if you look at Guyanese history, we had three major events that have been copied by others. I mean, Damon was way before Mahatma Gandhi. He waved the white flag. He fought colonialism peacefully, right?
Mhm.
1823. That was the most nonviolent revolution because the church influenced them, and instead of wanting to kill, they wanted to negotiate for their rights.
Like the
So
civil rights movement. Mhm.
right. So coffee was about freedom, was about rights, about independence. Same thing with 1823, it was about rights. Same thing with Damon, it was about rights. And if you were to read any history book, you would not see Guyana featuring like that. It's always Bossa or 1831 Baptist War. We have to, as Guyanese, to rewrite this history.
We
No one else
absolutely
can
have
do it.
to. No one else can do it. And David, please allow me just one more point.
you don't go right there. It's your
Yeah.
show.
So I had a really amazing conversation with Professor Cars yesterday, and in that conversation, she mentioned to me that there's a Guyanese gentleman who has written his dissertation on slavery and hydrology, slavery and the hydrological,
Yep.
the hydraulics
Peace.
of development.
Sugar states,
Meaning,
yeah.
and right. So he has an entire 398-page dissertation that is looking at the work that Africans did to create the plantations, all of the dikes, dams, canals,
Yes.
etc. And Eric, to your work and reparations, he makes the point that it is quite unfair. It's unjust. It is a miscarriage of justice to see enslavement in this environment and equate it to the enslavement of people in the Caribbean islands. They
Right.
were not confronted with the environment that our ancestors had to deal with. They
Olive,
did
let
not
me add
have
one
to.
point to that because you're right. If you add Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, and all the islands together, they cleared 8,000 square miles. We cleared 15,000 square miles of swamp and with all sorts of things, and that's been lost. We
And
cleared
not
twice
only
as
did we
much in
clear it,
Guyana as
we
all
did
the
the
other English islands combined.
we did the engineering work. The engineering work that created the space that we live in today. And every time I pass a coker, I think to myself of my ancestors and what it took to do that work. And to be now today ignored, to have
But
our
you see the
history
quality, you see
erased.
the quality of the work that's going on. But Olive, to your point on David, there's been a conspiracy of silence on our history. 1823 bicentennial ended on the 20th of August. If that was to happen in Jamaica or Barbados, there would have been a year of incredible events. Nothing happened again of any significance because the government does not want African Guyanese to know their history, to
They
know their
don't.
greatness, starting with 1763, where you're using diplomacy to form the first republic, and where you use the process of shared governance. And as Olive is right, Kofi realized that in order to succeed, he had to have peace with them to get trading rights. I mean, look what happened with bauxite. We nationalized it and they took away the markets. And he also had to maintain the plantation the way it is because he needed crops. And coffee was a crop. So all of the decisions Kofi made, if you look at them strategically, he was a thought leader.
He
He
was.
recognized that it was not sustainable any other route.
Mm-hmm. It was
In
not.
case you're just joining us, we had an early start tonight because I have another program later on in the evening. So we started at 6:30. We are discussing the 1763 revolution against the backdrop of a book that is written by Professor Margarine Cars. Um, uh, the book is called Blood on the River, and she had access to original documentations, um, testimonies from those who were captured by the Dutch. And she went into the Dutch archives and she's written this path breaking book, Blood on the River. And she's visiting Guyana and she would be making a presentation, a public presentation on Saturday at 5 p.m. at the Theatre Guild. And you are in Guyana, please make every effort to go there. Of course, there's limited seating, so try to get there as early as you can. But Olive,
It holds 300, so it's very limited. All of you may have to move it, get a big tent, and take it to Parade Ground or something.
I assume you all would be streaming it live, Olive.
David, we want to fill the house. We want to fill the house.
Okay.
If the house is full, then we will try to make that available. But right now, we want to fill the house because we know that our history is important. We know that from the colonial era, the British twisted our history to their benefit. And it's time that we take control and we demand that our history be taught. And so we need a show of force. We need people to turn out in their numbers to make it clear that African Guyanese are interested in their history. They want to learn more. And so that number is, but yes, it'd be great to have people online. It's better to have people in
I
person.
hope that this event by you, and I congratulate Ipadaji on this, will catalyze our young people. The archives in Den Haag, where she got all these documents, I visited it for a week last year. There is so much more additional stuff there for our young people to do PhDs and to do new work, especially in the light of repositioning that we were the first Black republic.
Yeah.
The Dutch looked at this as a business. So if they sent a gallon of water, it's in the book. And one of the things I wanted to do, I'm in Brazil right now for reparations, Olive. The Dutch brought enslaved Africans to Guyana before they took them to Suriname. So I wanted to know what tribes she found in the archives, because it would be the same tribes that went to Suriname. And we are blood brothers and sisters with Surinamese, but we're disconnected. So we need to get that connection as to which are the tribes that came to Guyana because they came here first before the Dutch took them to Suriname.
And you know, that history, there's a lot of the earlier history that's still fairly shrouded. We need to, and we were discussing that as well. The Dutch first, David?
No, you go ahead. Go ahead, Olive.
The Dutch first really came to this area in the Northwest and Orinoco area in the late 1500s, because they started to make inroads into the Portuguese and Spanish slave trade in the late 1500s. And so they were already bringing enslaved people to Brazil and then onto the northern coast of South America. So they
using
had
Curacao as a hub.
Right. And so they were in Pomeroon really before they were in Berbice. So we were still working on that dates. We know for a fact that the first enslaved persons came here in 1627. We know that. But we also feel very strongly that there were perhaps enslaved people here in the late 1500s. In the late 1500s. When you look at because they were trading coffee and so on, yes, they were trading with Amerindians, they traded annatto, but they were also here, they built a fort. They did not sweat to build that fort. So we think that we'd like to do some work to find out more. In addition to having the lecture on Saturday, Ipadaji is also mounting a very extensive exhibit. Extensive in that it varies in the kinds of artifacts and artwork that we will have that capture the essence of 1763 and that tell the story. As David mentioned, Professor Cars went to the archives and drew on original documents. Among them was over 900, the record of over 900 interrogations that the Dutch did. They interrogated people who were recaptured, and we have their names, we have what they were asked, we have what they responded to. Ipadaji has that. And so we're using that as part of our exhibit, and people who come will get a name of someone who was enslaved. A name. I mean, I thirst for hearing my ancestors' names. We are bringing to life persons who were pushed aside as nothing, people who built this country and made Europeans wealthy. We will know their names now, more and more of their names, and we must know their names and call on them.
Call their names. The 1823, when they had the court trials, they have a lot of work there too, a lot of names in the Council of World Mission in SOAS Library. But I want to bring a point which we don't talk about because we are caught up in this geopolitics. A lot of the slave owners in Guyana were Jewish. We run away from that. Who was Abraham Van Peer? We keep looking at the surnames, and the surnames trigger different thoughts because the surnames don't give you an identity.
But Abraham does.
Abraham does. Daniel Picot, who came from Suriname to fight coffee, I have a photograph of him. They gave it to me in Heidelberg. He was Jewish. Vance, look at the last name, Tim Hoggenheim. That's a Jewish name. I would say that 40% of the slave owners in Guyana were Jewish. And also, you should realize that Guyana almost became the Jewish state. 2/3 of Guyana almost became the Jewish state. So there's this other history that is hidden because the Jews had a lot of slaves in Tobago. That was their hub. And they were chased out to Brazil, they chased out to Suriname. But there's another big story there of history to let us understand how history repeats itself because Janet Jagan was Jewish. There's a whole nother circle.
That's amazing. That's so amazing. And it just says, it begs for our young people to understand the importance of knowing your history, because not only to avoid repeating it, but to demand what is just, to demand what is due to you. You know, the fact that our ancestors built this country is still, we have the receipts, as they say nowadays. We know we need to ensure we get all of those receipts and demand the reparations for what was done, because people are coming here all the time and getting wealthy on the foundation that we built.
You know, Olive, you talk about Coffee's organization. We saw it in 1823. The village movement was very well organized and thought through.
Yes,
So
yes.
there's this theme throughout people of African descent in Guyana. What we've done, the intellectual property, the
Eric, it
thinking, the
started,
thought leadership.
we showed them in Europe what we were capable of.
Yes, with the
Showed
Moors.
them in Europe.
And
Once we go back there.
we, in case you're just joining us, we started early tonight because I will have to leave just now. Vincent Alexander and I are on another program doing battle with those who would like to bury African Guyanese history. and we are going there to, as we would say in Jamaican parlance, to manners them. So, this discussion, as you all are testifying in the comments here, is riveting. Again, the discussion is on the 1763 revolution. The big takeaway from this program tonight, thanks to Olive Sampson, is that given everything that we now know, based on a book that is written by a Dutch-born professor, Professor Carr, who's visiting Guyana. The book is called Blood on the River. Given everything that we have read in that book, and that book is based on original documents. So we're not making this up. We have concluded, thanks to Olive Sampson, that the 1763 revolution represented the first Black Republic. The first Black Republic in the so-called Americas, because those revolutionaries held the colony and governed the colony for over a year. And that they were...
And David, almost 40% of them died. That is
Yes.
a sacrifice.
Right.
1,800 died.
They made. No. Professor Cards is making a presentation at the Theatre Guild in Georgetown, North Georgetown, on Saturday at 5 p.m. Those of you who are in the vicinity or even from afar, please try to attend.
4 o'clock.
4 o'clock, the exhibition,
5
and then 5 o'clock, she's going to make our presentation. And we are going to continue this discussion next week, Wednesday. As we say, Wednesday is African Day on Politics 101. And we are going to continue this conversation because we're onto something here that is important. Identity is important, and your identity comes from what you identify with. What you identify with. And we are beginning this new narrative here on this program that we as African Guyanese are identified with the first Black Republic. The first
David, we were the first builders of society in the Caribbean, the village movement.
The village movement, which you Sequoians call world history. So, Olive, Eric, thank you very much. We have to leave it here. And here's hoping that on Saturday, we have a full house and we have a very rich discussion. We come back here next Wednesday to continue this discussion about the first Black Republic in the African diaspora. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Good seeing you, Olive.
Good.
David, take care.
And thank you, the audience, for some of you came on early and some of you came on late. But next week, we'll continue this conversation. Those of you who are interested, Vincent Alexander and I would be on GlobeSpan in a couple of minutes. So we may see some of you over there. But tomorrow, I'll be back here with another edition of Politics 101. Stay woke. Stay woke.